What is it about student films that make them recognisable as student films? Is it the lighting, sound, story? There's a case to be made for all of those things, but one thing I believe makes a film studenty is 4 white walls. We're often limited to shooting in Airbnbs or our own student housing. Even with a fair amount of decoration, the look is still obvious. All of this is not only visually limiting in terms of lighting and production design, but also from a directorial standpoint. As a director, I can only choose to direct films that can be made with what I have available to rent, borrow, or hire. Shooting on location also gives us a lot less control over our environment. This can lead to a lack of shot variety and increased setup time between shots, which in turn can also lead to a lack of coverage. These are all things I wanted to avoid when it came to my final year film. The Adults Are Talking follows a police detective Smithy as she conducts her latest investigation in a totalitarian state. Most of the film takes place inside an interrogation room. Because of this, I drew a lot of inspiration from Criminal, a show which takes place entirely in an interrogation room and an observation room. My original set plan was to build one wall with a window to act as the observation room, and then use a location as the interrogation room. The set wall could be removed when not needed, and this could provide a dual perspective. This, however, is easier said than done. The challenge that I had was to build a set that looked genuinely real, in order to keep the audience immersed in the story. If the audience spotted flaws in the set, or realised it was in fact a set, they may take the film and its important themes less seriously. To do this, I'd have to build some studio flats. I began by watching some videos online by other amateur filmmakers about how they built theirs. With this in mind, I began drawing out some basic designs for some studio flats. I then began looking for materials. I decided to use MDF and plywood timber. Having purchased my materials, I decided to do a test and build a small part of the set. We cut the wood and MDF to make 2 3x4 foot flats, which I aim to use as the bottom of my observation window. This test proved useful, as it gave me a better idea of what tools and skills I would need for my main bulk of my project. It also identified some potential problems I would have to face, like drilling pilot holes for the timber, cost, and transport. After this, we began testing in the studio with the small flats I had built and some 4x8s the university let me borrow. We decided we only need to use one of the 4x3s I had made for the bottom of the window. Following lighting tests, we also decided that we wanted to use the studio's overhead lighting. Because of this, I needed to build the entire interrogation room as well as the observation room window wall. With a lot more work and materials now needed, I decided to find a place to get my materials cheaper. B&Q was the answer. I had to purchase 10 4x8 MDF flats and 60 8-foot pieces of timber. Obviously I couldn't fit all of that in my car, so whilst I waited for my delivery, I decided to test out some paints I had bought. The DOP and I had decided that we wanted the walls to be dark and cold, so I bought several shades of grey and painted them onto one of my flats to test in the studio. We decided to go with a dark grey on the bottom 3 feet and a light grey on the top 5 feet, with an orange stripe in the middle to add some contrast and colour. A few days later, the wood arrived. The first step was to build the frames to support the flats. I needed to cut some wood to size in order to do this. Be careful to keep fingers away from sharp tools and do not work alone. Once everything had been cut to size, it all needed to be drilled and glued together. Make sure you're careful when drilling. So one problem we're having with screws is we're having to drill pilot holes anyway to get them in, but this one here has got caught in the knot and won't go any further. So the only choice we really had was to break it off. So now what we've got to do is we've got to round out the hole, widen it up. That was originally in and drill another one, but this has happened a couple of times. We managed to get one out earlier, but one thing we need to try and avoid is knots like this, because they're just really hard to get these screws through. Once all the frames had been put together, we needed to attach them to the MDF 4x8s. However, the original wood glue I bought wasn't strong enough to safely hold the frames in place. The next day, having bought some much stronger Gorilla Glue, I began assembling the flats. I did this by smothering one side in glue, then carefully lowering the MDF in place. I had to make sure the MDF was perfectly in line with the frame before drilling in screws into the corners to reinforce the glue. The next step was painting. We had to be careful not to go across the line of masking tape into the other section of colour, because if we did, we'd have to repaint. Once complete, it was time to move the flats to the studio. Feeling strong, we attempted to do this between the three of us initially. However, we quickly realised this was impractical and potentially unsafe, so we called upon some more friends who were willing to help us out. The next stage was building the jacks to hold up the flats. I tested a few different joints originally, but found I did not have the tools to make them properly, or they didn't feel stable enough to support an entire flat. In the end, I created L shapes from 2 pieces of timber, and then used 2 more pieces to reinforce that. All of this was glued and screwed together. With everything assembled, we began testing with the set. One problem we found was that the flats didn't line up perfectly together, and gaps between them were obvious. This was a problem, as if the audience saw any gaps, the fact that we were using a set would be obvious, and they would not be convinced and even become less invested in the film. We also found that the set was quite echoey, which could be a problem for sound. We conducted a short lighting test with the set. This highlighted that the set would also need more decoration. As interrogation rooms are meant to be relatively soundproof, I decided to purchase some foam sound panels, something I thought might solve all of these problems. I stuck these onto the set in a pattern, covering the gaps between the flats. I also added a fake security camera and a filing cabinet. All of this added a lot more depth to the set. After adding some posters, we conducted our final test. Unfortunately, we didn't have sound equipment at this point, so had to record dialogue through a phone.
After you clocked out, where did you go?
Back to my apartment. Look, I don't pretend to like the state, but I do my fair share of work like everyone else. Look, I already told you I was at my apartment. My shift was over.
Only a fool would attempt this on their shift.
Only a fool would attempt this at all! You've got the wrong person.
What do you want me to do with that information, Ian? I think I'll just head to my boss and say you promised you didn't do anything? Look, if you just cooperated, there wouldn't be a need for this.
If I cooperated, then I would be dead.
Officer, stand down for fuck's sake!
Overall, I feel the set was convincing for the most part. However, I feel like the observation wall was the weakest element. Not only was it complicated to put together, but it can be seen slightly where the flats overlap. Also, a small piece of fabric had to be used to hold the glass straight, and that can also be seen. Though, for the most part, the set as a whole, especially the interrogation room, is pretty seamless, and seems genuinely convincing, enough to pass as a real state interrogation room, and hopefully be convincing for an audience watching the film.